Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co host, Nathan Rittenhouse. In this episode, Cameron leads us in a discussion of the pursuit of the good life, and we look at a whole litany of everything from diet to physical activity to all forms of hedonism, distraction, hallucination, back to the land, you name it, of ways in which people have tried to answer the question, what is a good life? This is a question that if you don't implicitly have in your mind, everybody around you does. And so this episode will be helpful for you, particularly if you're a Christian trying to engage this world for the rest of your life. If you enjoy what we do, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, or if you want to support our work and find out more about what we're up to, you can do so by visiting www.toltogether.com.
So it seems to me that the question of our moment, Nathan, is not what does it mean to be human, not something involving identity or sexual ethics. Those are all very important, but I think they're outworkings of a much more ancient and profound question, and that is, what is the good life? And I'm not the only one saying this. This is cropping up more and more. If you look at some of the major Ivy League schools, some of the most popular courses either involve the study of ancient thought or they really center on this question. What is a good life? What is a fulfilling life? What is a meaningful life? And I think that's really fascinating. And even questions about identity, questions about sexual expression, questions about what does it mean to be human are, you could say, those could be seen to be outworkings of the more central question, what is the good life? And I think part of why we're here, Nathan, is I think this is basically the practical outworking of what's being called the meaning crisis. And we've talked about that before. We've mentioned some of the contributing factors. You can break them down actually quite easily into socioeconomic factors and then some social factors as well. The
Mm-hmm.
socioeconomic ones are, rising. You have inflation, you have major student debt for a lot of young people. You have, real estate trends do not look very optimistic, especially for young people. Many young people are pretty fairly confident they'll never own property. They'll never own property. I mean, that right there is a huge blow to a key aspect of the American dream right there. Social media is contributing to a great deal of social isolation and also the self-comparison that comes along with that. But also on the social front, I think these are the more dramatic changes. People are getting married less, and when they do get married, they're getting married later, and they are having fewer children as well. They're not going to church as much. They're less involved in, so much of this was elaborated years. It's not like this is all brand new. I mean, Robert Putnam, when he wrote Bowling Alone, captured a lot of these social trends, but
Mm-hmm.
they've just continued to escalate since that book was written. So people are out of touch with their neighbors. And so the kind of net effect of all of this is a growing sense of loneliness and isolation, depression, and a loss of meaning, which I think if you just name all of this out loud, I think that makes sad sense, as we often say. I don't think that sounds too surprising that if you live an isolated existence, cut off from community and other human beings in a meaningful sense, in a face-to-face sense, that life is going to come to feel hollow and there's going to be a loss of significance.
Mm-hmm.
So I can pause there for a second. I think that's the
So,
context for why that question is arising.
there's a little bit of like, okay,
Yeah.
boomer moment
Good
here of
morning, by
like,
the
okay,
way.
kids these days is all, yeah, it's all about those, blah, blah, blah. Oh, here we are, grumpy old
Yeah, yeah.
men and our, no. So, couple thoughts that I wanted to toss out there as we go. First of all, I don't think any of this is new. I think perhaps there are technological ways in which we amplify this that are unique to our time. Um, but I want to plant my flag on that of saying this is. I mean, you have all the way back to Solomon. Um, meaningless, vanity, vanity. There's that whole like, what is the purpose of life? What are we trying to do? Um, but that being said, what I would be interested for our conversation uh, to develop into for a second is, so what are the options that you see being pitched? Because right now, I don't think people are pursuing something and finding nothing. I think they're just assuming there is nothing and tossing up their hands like, well, this is it. Um, or do you see any like, so what are the answers to that meaninglessness that I think you're hearing secularly? Because I think even, I don't know, was it John Gray or who was saying recently, like, actually philosophy is providing no good answers to this right now. It's not like you can go to a
Yeah.
secular philosophy department at your local university and talk to the head of um, the philosophy department. They'll be like, yeah, this is what
Hmm.
you should do with your life.
Hmm.
Nobody's telling good stories
Yep.
right now. Like, there's no secular meta narrative or vision of reality or story of what it means to be human or what a human even is. That to me seems remotely fascinating. And so either I'm missing something and everything that I'm reading is missing something, or nobody's coming up with anything to like. So I think your analysis of the problem, fine. Everybody's doing that. We can all see it. But the question is, so where do you see an answer?
I see an answer in people winding the clocks back and going back to the ancients. And this is actually so. Hey, here's something we haven't done in a while. I'm gonna at least sound quite hopeful here because I'm gonna name some trends that I think are actually real signs of life, and I think present a key opportunity for those of us who follow Jesus. And this has been happening. So in 1999, 1995, rather, a really prescient book came out by a French philosopher, actually a historian of ideas, named Pierre Hadot. And it was called Philosophy as a Way of Life. It's a magnificent book, not an easy read, but a lot of magnificent books aren't easy reads. So but really what he's doing is first of all, he's taking direct aim at the problem you just named. It is a scandal, and it is really sad that today, if you want practical answers on how to lead a meaningful life or just how to fight off that constant feeling of insignificance, a professional philosopher is the last person you would go to. Maybe you go to a therapist or a guidance counselor or a financial analyst. I don't know. We have all sorts of people we would go to before, maybe a pastor, priest. You certainly wouldn't go to a philosopher because philosophers are known as the people who live in an ivory tower or just dusty academics and carry out interminable debates in impenetrable prose that nobody else but other philosophers can understand. So in the book Philosophy as a Way of Life, it's in the title. Pierre Hadot is arguing passionately for a return to philosophy as a set of practices for living well and living wisely, and not just practices but spiritual practices. Now, Pierre Hadot was actually at one point was trained as a priest in his early years, and I believe at 23 he walked away from the church and so I don't believe he was a Christian, but he was a deep believer in spiritual disciplines and spiritual practices. But the people he had in mind specifically, and here's where his book's going to sound prophetic and familiar, the people he especially admired were the Stoics. So he had especially Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus as well. I want to center on these two figures for just a second because there's a fascinating contrast between Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. Because Marcus Aurelius was, I mean, the ruler, the most powerful man alive, had everything at his disposal, whatever he wanted on whatever terms. And, as Lord Acton famously said, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts. But we got a problem, except for the bizarre, anomalous case of Marcus Aurelius. Somehow, he withstood that greatest test of one's characters, and that is absolute abundance and power, and it didn't corrupt him. So you have him, and then you have Epictetus. Epictetus spent most of his life as a slave, and yet and you mentioned the character. This occurred to me the other day, Nathan, not too long ago. We were talking about East of Eden, and you mentioned the character of the cook Lee, right?
Hmm.
I believe he's modeled on Epictetus because he's the guy who says, it doesn't matter whether you're a master or a slave, the nobility of your character is under your direct control. And so, I mean, at the heart of Stoicism, and it's a very rich philosophy, I can't possibly do full justice to it here, but at the heart of it is a very noble ideal, which is you have under your control Very, very little, a vanishingly small amount of things, unless you're Marcus Aurelius. But what you do have under control is yourself, your character. So in order to lead a good life, you want to cultivate virtue in your life. You want to be a virtuous person who not only treats others with dignity and respect, but who isn't prone to overindulgence, who has exhibits real self-control, self-governance. So so what's fascinating is that Marcus Aurelius in particular, his book, which, well, it's a book now, it was written purely for himself at the time. It was his meditations were never meant for publication. He actually instructed those, he said, "Burn this upon my death." And of course, fortunately for us, you know, the executors of his estate did not do that. But it's been massively popular. It's been selling. I mean, it sells in the millions now, but courses on Marcus Aurelius are immensely popular right now. And it'd be easy to you could some people will dismiss this and say, "Ah, it's just a bunch of gym bros who are, kind of taking this philosophy and running with it and using it to promote bodybuilding or whatever." But actually, I think something much deeper is going on. And, a lot of the people who are purchasing this book, unsurprisingly, are men, but I think something deeper is going on. I think people are looking to this philosophy and somebody of real nobility, Marcus Aurelius, and they're seeing in them a possibility of real spiritual transformation. I think it's a powerful start. And I'll just say this last piece, Nathan. It's interesting that you bring in Solomon. So, and I've thought about this a bit. Solomon and Marcus Aurelius both had, you know, access to immensity, immense wealth that we can't even imagine. But on another hand, they're a little bit relatable to us these days. They're more so Solomon and Marcus Aurelius would be a lot less relatable to people in the Middle Ages, I think, for instance.
Mhm.
But for
Yeah.
us, indulgent as we are, as affluent, and I know I named a bunch of economic factors that show that we're a lot of people are struggling, but we're struggling in 21st century terms, which is very, very, very different from how people struggled economically in even the recent past. So the practical reality is, at our disposal, we have access to so much. We have unfettered access to, I mean, essentially whatever we want at our fingertips. Food, sex, entertainment, you name it. I mean, ours is a cultural moment that is defined by unbelievable excess. That's hard to imagine, and unbelievable amounts of power in so many of our hands. And for most, I mean, even just in normal, common people, we have so much power. So, am I saying we're exactly like, Solomon and Marcus Aurelius? No, not at all. But I am saying our challenge is similar to theirs in that it is not the challenge of Epictetus, it is the challenge of navigating a world of excess and trying to lead a meaningful life in that context.
That's why I think it's fascinating when you look at Paul in Philippians when he's talking about, "I've learned to be content in all circumstances." He lists the whole, like,
That's the passage that comes to mind. Both,
yeah,
yeah, both, right? Poverty
both
and
directions.
wealth.
And wealth, yeah, and
Yes.
so I think really
Yeah.
looking at Paul's statement that he's learned to be content in the times of wealth and prosperity is as impressive as the other, um, really when we're working this out. Um, I wanna loop back around and kinda talk about avenues out of this. So one is I think there's a sense in which the the yearning for virtuousness or the Marcus Aurelius types of it's almost a sense of like, okay, there's the bodybuilding world where I'm going to like craft and sculpt my physical body. And you can say what are the motivations, reasons for that. But then there's also the virtue ethic of like I'm going to craft and sculpt my internal way of being and my self control and my emotion. That both of those can ultimately be a focus on self, and so the New Testament does lay out, I think Jesus is a virtue ethicist to a significant degree. If you look at, Paul's teaching on self-control, that's actually seen as part of the fruit of the spirit. So there's a heavy emphasis on that, but there's a difference that Christianity brings in this where there's a difference between like I can lift this much weight and I can lift this much weight to help somebody out, or I have these personal characteristics and qualities, or I have these personal characteristics and qualities, and that makes me a better citizen and participant in the community around me. And so it's not about gaining the strength, it's what we do with the strength that we cultivate that is where Jesus, I think, is pushing beyond kind of that earlier Greek um, virtue ethic, Aristotelian concepts of the good that really then converted into kind of a love and a what's the word, like a prescriptive orientation and action toward the outside world rather
Mhm.
than just an internal state of being, which I think is one of my fundamental irritations with a lot of Eastern expressions of meditation and philosophy, and because it does ultimately end up with a fairly deep inward curl to it, and I think
Mhm.
we're situated for that to be the same in our lives right now, and obviously you and I are going to default to that the outward curl, the worship, the ability to focus on something other than ourselves and to live for something more than ourselves is where we really find the oughtness and the fulfillment and the pleasure of what it means to be human. But can you say something to that, like the Marcus Aurelius, the gym
Yeah.
strength is a good step, but it certainly isn't the fullness of what like if you could
Yeah.
bench press 400 pounds but refuse to help your kid open a jar of olives, like what's the point here?
Mhm. Yeah, I think so to bring in the gym piece for just a second, there is a superficial reading of that, which is really just all about how you look and also just being physically stronger than other people, looking down on them. But there's a side of it that's deeper than that, and it has to do with it's just one this you think of this as one activity where you are learning to abstain from the excesses around you. In this case, so many people in our nation, let's just take America for instance, are, one of the leading killers in America is of course is heart disease, right?
Mhm.
And it's what's staggering about that, you step back for a second, is how avoidable it is. Now I know it's more complex, because people have a complex way of looking at food. Food is it's not just fuel for people. It's more than that. But when you get into a certain mindset and you recognize I want to cultivate the discipline to be able to yeah, it's just one way of curbing your appetites, controlling them, but it's one way of navigating a world of excess. And our world of excess is everywhere. It's not just if you work in an office, there will be available in that office all sorts of food all the time in front of your face. And it's not that much, you would think, to just cultivate the strength or the discipline to avoid it. And yet many people don't. So
But
there's a focus on trying to cultivate a sense of discipline where you're able to navigate those excesses and move past them. But I
mhm.
think what there's a bigger problem here, Nathan, and you mentioned it with the word ought. So what's the telos? What's the end goal of all this? What structures virtue cultivation? So why are we cultivating virtue in the first place? If do you have, in other words, a deeper moral vision? For some people, that moral vision won't go far beyond a physical transformation. It's not true of everybody. It's true of but it is true of some.
Yeah, but
And then you
I don't
ironically
think
yeah.
I think that's just because this is a little bit of the Jordan Peterson make your own bed thing, where we look at the chaos of the world and we say, okay, I can't change what's going on in Gaza right now, but I can, in certain aspects and elements of my life, take control. And so my own body, my own mind, those that is the
Yep.
realm in which I feel like I have some authority and some responsibility. And so I think this is the Christian challenge here is to think about what is the size of my responsibility in the oughtness. So you even have in scripture physical training is of some value, but godliness, and it goes on from there. And so I see the gym, the Marcus Aurelius, I see that all as a step, as a baby step in the right direction.
But
but there's a bigger
It
vision
is.
at plays. Yeah.
Well, even Marcus Aurelius can help us with the gem thing, because Marcus Aurelius is constantly saying, and all the other Stoics are constantly saying, "Have death before you at all times." And what I see often in gym culture is a powerful delusional denial of death. Reverse the
Mm.
clock. Turn the clock back. And I hear this more and more because I'm in my 40s, and this is part of my life. I'm an avid gym goer. I'm married to somebody who's a bodybuilder, but I can't turn the clock back. Yes, I can age well. Yes, I can age gracefully, but I am still going to die, and there will come a day, sooner now rather than later, where I won't be able to lift things as heavy. And if I do, I'm gonna hurt myself, or I'm going to. And this is where you see people abusing performance enhancing drugs and all of this kind of thing. Now this is profoundly unstoical,
Mhm.
because
Right.
the Stoic would also point out, as a Christian would point out, if something like this, if fitness, for instance, becomes an idol to you, you're in deep, deep trouble because, hey, you're one injury away from, if that's your whole identity, you're one serious injury away from having your whole world destroyed. And we see this, of course, all the time, and especially it's very conspicuous in athletes, right, who sustain serious career-ending injuries. And then they all say some variation of the same thing. I don't know who I am anymore.
Mhm.
So this is why, if we're talking about actual the cultivation of actual deep spiritual virtues, yeah, physical training is of some value, but it can't be the only value. Our We have to constantly remember that our culture is profoundly materialistic. And I don't mean that in ideological sense. I'm not saying, well, we're all atheists and secularism is one. I just mean that we default to thinking that the stuff that really matters is what just the concrete stuff around you, and we discount spiritual reality. So if I lose if I've got a six pack and I look amazing and I'm an incredible athlete, and one day I have I hurt my back doing barbell squats, that is going to constitute a major crisis if it's all completely wrapped up in that. And
So this is
actual
just
virtue is focused deeper than that. Yeah.
so we're intentionally setting aside the religious answers to the question here. So
Yes. Yeah.
the
Because this is a
physical,
stepping stone, I think, for
this is
people.
the
Yep.
there's the physical. So let's talk about some of the other attempts at the good life. So we've kind of talked about, like, okay, there's
Yep.
the personal modification. Then there's the
Yep.
realization that comes after that, that humans are made for relationship and made for community. So you have
Mhm.
a phenomenal sense of join an organization, join a group, join a club. When you're talking about the death before you, I was reading something in Tolstoy about the Masons, and that being one of the things that one of the characters is struggling with, of this idea of always having, not being afraid of death
Mhm.
or loving the concept of death. And so joining lodges, organizations, um, nonprofits, charity, anthropic, that type of thing. That's certainly a way that I think a lot of people pursue finding something good in life, to a certain extent. Would you say that's kind of like the next
Oh,
step?
yeah. Oh, I think you have a huge resurgence of that in, let's say, local movements. And I mean, this stuff is really gaining traction. So you have everything from, one very easy place to point out is, people will say, "Oh, shop local," but that's something. But then on a deeper level, you do have people who are, especially a lot of tech entrepreneurs do this. They exit the tech world and they move on to a farm, and or they move to an island and cultivate an extremely sort of, well, it's not totally rustic, but it's rustic by
It's
the
the
stand.
glamping
They
version.
go from living in
Yeah.
the glamping, exactly. So I mean, they're not living in Brooklyn anymore, but they're in Costa Rica, and it's relatively simpler existence. But you have more of that, but also from just a regular person standpoint, you have a greater concentration from a lot of political scientists and a lot of thinkers saying, "Hey, you need to think more about your community, pouring into, so don't worry so much about national elections. They're important, I suppose, but you exercise almost no power whatsoever. But the power of your citizenship makes a lot bigger of a difference where you live in your community, in your town, your neighborhood. So get involved there." I
Okay,
do see a, yeah, a lot of
this is
that.
this is where my cynicism floats to the surface. So let me just pump the brakes on this whole thing. Because
Uh-huh.
I live in one of those places where people come to fulfill those dreams and
Yeah.
desires, and it usually doesn't turn out for them.
Nathan is the
So
Wendell Berry of West Virginia. That's how I
so
always talk about you.
so let me back way up here. And there was a book written by Helen and Scott Nearing called The Good Life. And that this is the fundamental. So we're talking about The Good Life. I was like, oh, I'll grab the book off my shelf called The Good Life. And this is like the
Yeah.
foundational text for the back to land hippie, whatever you want to call it. We're going to go raise
Back to
goats, be
land. Yeah, I
organic, and
should have
eat
said that.
eat blueberries
Mhm.
and in a commune. Um, and so there are two volumes.
Portlandia had some good stuff to say about this, didn't
Well, yeah, I
it?
think that squash plant they planted in the soccer field there didn't live. Um,
Yeah.
so the s- so here are a couple things. So in the 1930s, they get disillusioned with they were teaching academics, and they were okay. Get this, they were vegetarians, pacifist, and collectivist. Surprise! So here's what happens almost like on repeat is you go through these phases of cultural disruption, the young people get frustrated, and then you assume that whatever economic system you're in, the opposite one is the best one. So the
Sure.
poor socialists think capitalism is it's like the blondes want to be brunettes and the brunettes want to be blondes, and then the capitalists want to be socialist, and the like there's some of this that just repeats itself with enough regularity in history that you can laugh about it. So anyway, they go to Vermont, short time in Vermont, move to Maine, buy a farm, and they're like, building stone houses and by hand and eating blueberries and living off the land and teaching some and making maple syrup. And it's kind of the thing. So they're doing this like late 30s. Then by the time the 60s roll around, they're like 30 years into this. So this becomes like the mecca of like you go visit these people if you want
Mhm.
to see how this is done. And then they end up giving land to a guy named Elliot Coleman, who's like the godfather of the whole organic food movement in the United States. So there's a thread you can connect here all the way back to these folks. But a couple of the things that I wanted to point out from their writings, which and then there's a whole series of books and literature of people who like live next door to them and they're like, yeah, and here's the real story, the real behind the scenes of how this worked and some of the criticisms,
Yeah.
which I think are really valid. And I can get into that some other time. But what's interesting is this is Scott Nearing talking about who came to visit. And so at one point they had like 2,000 to 2,500 young people a year coming to visit their farm. Um, so and he writes this. So this is like the 1980s when he wrote this, and they continued the experiment beyond this. But he said increasingly they are turning their backs on a world community that has tolerated war and is preparing for a contingency of one in the future. They are ardently in favor of peace in a broad sense, but are not ready to accept a commitment to any organization that works collectively for its cause. Almost universally, listen to this sentence. Almost universally, they favor quote air quotes freedom, that is the pursuit of their personal goals and fancies. They are not joiners
Hmm.
and generally not members of any group more specific than is implied by the adoption of specific diet or practice of some yoga exercise. This is
Hmm.
40 years ago now, people, that this
They're good
definition. So they
old-fashioned
don't join any
individualists.
organizations.
Yeah.
Good old fashioned. They are wanderers and seekers, feeling their way toward an escape from orthodoxy and superficiality with the nervous dissatisfaction that characterizes people who do not have a home base in any real sense. Perhaps they can be
Mm.
best described as unsettled. Never before in our lives have we met so many unattached, uncommitted, insecure, uncertain human beings.
Wow. Very on the nose, too. I mean, I think we have to call them spiritual orphans is what we would call them.
Yeah, so they're
But
pilgrims, they're
wow.
seekers, and it's a wild. But here's you said socioeconomic in the beginning. That's what made me think down this whole line. But he said,
Sure.
so he said this. So this is 89. I think he's writing this. We do not remember having one black youngster come, or one daughter or son of a coal miner, nor do we recall young people whose parents worked in textile factories or steel mills. We had daughters and sons galore of merchants, of doctors,
Mhm.
teachers, lawyers, bankers, and public officials, people who had been born into influence of a sort, raised in comfort, if not pampered in luxury. They had little or no real work experience. They might have washed dishes, run errands, or sold merchandise or taught at a school for a short time, but they had stuck at nothing for long. Occasionally, we had a visitor who had worked on a farm or knew his way around. Some had real skills. These were among the exceptions.
Hmm.
And this is true, like, in the 19 like, the early '70s, my grandparents had, like, 700 people a year visiting their farm, and my grandpa just pointed out, like, how often they were from very, very well-to-do families. And so
Hmm.
this was, like, the main version, and my grandparents were kind of accidentally running a parallel West Virginia version of this, of just, like, young people who are like, "Forget it, we're walking off into the mountains to figure out, the purpose of life." But all the connections here, like, what are the consistencies here? And then how do they map onto the present? And that's why at the beginning I said, like, there's nothing new under the sun here. So you have people who come
Yeah.
from relative affluence, which the thing of it is that now that category fits way more people, like a higher
Way more people.
percentage of young people. Like,
Yep.
you have more access to a more diverse diet on minimum wage in the United States than Solomon as the king of Israel did in his time. Like, just think of it in those
Yes.
terms. So
That's
so
that
the
was my point earlier. Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So the relative affluence is there. The We
Yep.
don't join anything or commit to anything. We're not rooted anywhere. We don't join any organization other than those who, like, maybe tangentially suit our freedoms and our fancies, usually around a diet or some kind of spiritual exercise program. So it seems to me like when I look at a lot of the options that are being passed around now, I'm like, yes, but everybody's tried these already and they don't work. And so I think there's like there's a tragic humor to this for me of
Oh
we're
yeah.
asking the
There's
same
absolutely a
questions and we're trying the same answers that haven't worked since
well.
people have been writing down this stuff, except for one obvious
Okay.
one, which we'll get to.
I'm going to make one large observation here. Yeah, you're describing the basic cycles of history, and I think cycles of history are more accurate. This is, by the way, this is what the ancients believed. We So I want to word this very carefully. I am a Christian, of course. So I do believe, as a Christian, as people who follow Jesus, we are walking forward. It is an actual journey with an actual destination. And I believe history has a point of consummation with Christ and the making all things new and the creation, and the restoration of all things, a new heavens and a new earth. So I do believe in that. Okay. But that said, that's an article of faith for me as a Christian. But I also want to make a few remarks about life under the sun, to use, the sage of Ecclesiastes phraseology here. And that is that you will see things run in cycles. This was always the thought of the ancients. If you look at ancient Greece, they didn't assume that that history was a journey of progress towards some great goal. You know why we think that now? We think that because of Christianity. Even if you're a
Mhm.
really secular person, if you have some vision of progress, it is on borrowed credit from Christian eschatology. Nobody else has ever thought that. They have always thought great empires come and then they go. They rise and they crash. Movements come and then they crash. So back to earth, yeah, sometimes, people grow tired of cultural decadence and excess, and they grow, bloated and in self-indulgent, so they go back to the land, so they go back to discipline, and then that crashes and burns. So I want to say that cyclical view is true in many aspects of life under the sun.
Do
It
you wanna know
really
why
is.
I
So
think
things
so?
come and go. So that Yeah, why?
Because it's experiential human knowledge that can't be digitally stored. It's
Yeah.
it's a it's
Well,
it's a weird form of, like, you can't know it until you experience it, and therefore you like,
yep,
people can write it down, but unless you have the hunger of the life experience to go back and read how this has happened beforehand, it's not like it's a
yep.
every generation that you're born as an infant and you have to learn and grow,
You
you
have to
aren't born
rediscover.
with the latent knowledge of all the generations before you in your
Nope.
DNA. You have to learn that in
Yep,
community and in story and in the wisdom
yep.
of the people in a geographic space around you in order to even have the starting blocks to start to piece together something that would
And right
constitute a
now,
definition.
yeah, so for all of our technological infrastructure right now, we are so bad at what you just mentioned there. At
Yeah.
not just the word education isn't even the right word here, educating a younger generation. Helping, I don't even know what word I would use because it's way more holistic than that, but when you have a community, it's maybe captured in phrases like, "It takes a village to raise a child." Yes, it does, but we live in a but in our modern context, increasingly, children are raised in isolation, or they're outsourced to daycares and all that, and I'm not saying that in a mode
No,
of,
that's because we live in
criticism or
isolation. What are we
dismissiveness. It's
talking about? It's not like our kids' experience are detached
right.
from our own.
Right, and the nuclear family, the notion that you're just, this all of this cuts off that passing on of a heritage that was, I mean, you find it, and of course, I think I mentioned this earlier, you find it in the Old Testament, in one very obvious place to look is the celebration of Passover. That is, I love,
Mhm.
Drew Johnson's way of putting this is for the Hebrew mind, memory is physical. And of course, and you could say, and then nowadays for Christians who, if you look at the practice of communion like this, so but all of that, we're so bad at that, and yeah, it doesn't. You don't come. Now this you got a software update, so now this is all in there and it's ready, and the person's is good to handle all these issues. That's not the way a human being works. We're not machines. So, yeah, we're really bad at that right now. And I think the other piece here though, Nathan, is what you're mentioning, and this is gonna sound callous, but it's not, it's descriptive, is just you find that having a crisis of meaning is a luxury.
Mhm.
More and more I've been thinking about that because the book you just quoted from is not the only one that, I mean, another darker place to point would be, you know, Al Qaeda or ISIS recruiting Westerners, young Western people into their radical activities. Most of them are upper middle class kids who come from exactly those backgrounds described by those two back to land, professors. So
Mhm.
it, it's not people who basically are having to, survive by the sweat of their brow and just the
Well,
practical demands
yeah.
of just staying alive. Yeah.
Well, no, I was gonna say that was the you could put for most every organism that the adventure of life has been finding enough to eat and reproducing. And so
Yeah.
nobody was sitting around thinking like, what like no Russian peasants were wondering what is the purpose of life. Um,
What's the meaning of me being a blacksmith? Is this really who I'm meant to be? I mean, we take for granted, this is why history is so helpful. If you read good history that helps you to try to put you in the mind of a foreign mindset. But yeah, that kind of question, there were eras, there were time periods in which a question like, "Is this really what I ought to be doing?" would never occur to a person. It's not the kind of question that would even enter into somebody's imagination. This is and it doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad question, but, it would if you ask that, "Well, I'm the son of a blacksmith, so, I mean, what else do you think I would do?" But now,
yeah.
the son of a doctor or a lawyer, "Well, yeah, well, I wanna join the Peace Corps," or, I wanna go hike the Appalachian Trail, or, "Oh, I wanna go to Europe and backpack through and find myself and see what life is all about," or, "Maybe I wanna go to India and volunteer at a hospital." None of these activities are
Great.
necessarily
Yeah.
bad,
Yeah.
but it's yeah. Anyway, it's definitely a feature of a hyper-individualistic modern age where you have a lot more time, a lot more money, and a lot more resources at your disposal to go out and do some serious navel gazing.
So these are good activities, but they are not good answers to the fundamental questions you're asking.
No, and I just have to say in passing, the other big thing that we didn't mention, which is probably so obvious that we don't need the other big answer to what is the good life would be hedonism.
Oh,
You
right.
know,
Yeah.
eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. I think that's a huge answer of our culture, and I don't really think it demands much commentary. Frankly, I think it's pretty. sort of speaks for itself. But I think I
Per
wanted to put that out there as
Okay.
well. Yeah.
So here's one that now let's dwell on this a second because I was thinking when I was making a list in my head while we were talking about this of options is sedation is also an option. And it's hard
Oh
for me to
yeah.
distinguish between hedonism and sedation. And even if you're listening to the techno-futurism bros about like some of the value of AI, it's like, hey, there will be a point where basically you can live with your virtual reality goggles on, and maybe we'll like we'll inject you'll have an IV drip and you'll sleep 23 hours a day and wake up and do 1 hour a day of virtual activity. Um,
Yeah.
that is it's a form of hedonism that really is just sucking all of
It
the
is.
something out of human existence.
Well, and I think we've talked about before on the podcast. I see a huge the way I see this often expressed is through the idea of mood control. And the idea that you either constantly have to have some form of stimulus, or you have to have some sort of mind altering substance so that you can endure and feel so that you can feel good in a variety of stressful circumstances, whether you're going into a a Zoom call that you're really not excited about, or going to some family reunion with, your crazy Uncle Ed who's gonna talk your ear off about politics. So the idea is, well, maybe you just take an edible before one of these things, or pour some vodka and some orange juice and, have
Oh,
that. But
what is the
yeah,
Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Who is that writer?
yeah, Philip K. Dick. Philip Dick.
Because that's the book that Blade Runner is based on, I think. And in that, there's that whole thing
Correct.
about
Yeah.
you punch in the code for the mood that you want, and that's seen as like
Yes.
the
Yeah.
technological
Exactly.
solution to it.
Yep. And of course, Philip K. Dick was a big psychedelics guy and experimented a ton with. But I mean, he wasn't. Yeah. Anyway, that's a whole separate. But yes, you're right.
So
That
so
sedated kind of
distraction and sedation
distraction.
is
Yep.
a
Well, you remember
um
the perfect example is that you remember the scene from The Matrix where okay, I can't even remember his name now. The one guy goes to the aliens and betrays everybody because he wants to go back into the Matrix. Remember? And he specifies precisely. He's aware it's an illusion, but he doesn't care. He's eating that steak, and he goes, I know the steak isn't real, but it tastes good, and I like it. Can you, make me rich? Put me in this nice, area or whatever." And and of course, it doesn't work out the way he wants it to, but he spells out his ideal fantasy and wants to live in that fantasy. I think that what's chilling about that is that it is demonstrably the case that there are many people who would take that very option. And of course, there's nothing new there. That this really is kind of all this goes back to Plato's cave
mhm,
and
mhm.
the people who prefer the illusion rather than the harsh reality. But yeah, you're right. I would agree with you. That's an iteration of hedonism, just in this, but it has a lot less vitality than traditional hedonism. I know this sounds weird, but I don't know. I'm sorry. I think if you're going out to music festivals or clubs and all that, and you're sleeping with a bunch of people, I think you're actually a step closer to real human connection and real life than you are if you're disconnecting like that and kind of retreating into a world of pure fantasy. I think the traditional hedonist, can we call them that, has more of a
Yeah.
chance of being saved than the person who has said, "I can't deal with reality. I prefer the illusion. Leave me in my fantasy." For
Okay.
what it's worth. I'm not
So
recommending either. Come on, don't
not
take me out of
really.
context. Yeah.
So let's summarize here quickly. We're looking at the pursuit of the good life, which whether people conscientiously articulate what they're doing that way or not, that is what people do. Is they pursue a good life or a good version of life or something that at least seems to be avoid pain, and if some pleasure is part of it too, that's great. But we kind of talked our way through everything from food and diet to exercise to mental stability to meditation to back to the land to sedation, distraction, um, hallucination. And we're just, I think Cameron, for the two of us, I'm 38, you're 40, um, at this point of life where you start to say, like, okay, I've looked at the other options enough that I'm comfortable looping back around to something and being like, yeah, okay. We've kind of looked at that for 30 years now. Maybe it just is the case that those are dead ends, or you start reading enough history or enough philosophy to recognize that these are paths that go nowhere. And I think that also so you said you see a trend of, people reading Marcus Aurelius. There's also a huge trend of people going back to church of like, wait a second, perhaps some of these ancient ways that were formed as answers to ancient questions that humans have always had about what is the purpose of my life? What is God? What is the universe? What is my role in it? What is my responsibility? How do I fit in? How is it that I'm supposed to behave? Where are we going? How do I relate to other people? That there are structures in this world who have for a very long time been answering that question. And obviously, as Christians, we're two of the crowd who have pitched our lot in with Christ and been like, yeah, if you look at what he said. And then there's also a warning here if you're in church leadership or you're part of a congregation and you look at, the Nearians were talking about young people leaving orthodoxy, is to make sure that we're teaching the proper orthodoxy in our places of worship and that it's orthodoxy theologically and not culturally to say, are we building some weird hybrid of Christianity plus cultural infatuation, or where is the church trying to spin off into these other forms that haven't worked? And so I would say just a reminder to stay true to the course here if you're in church or spiritual leadership to help people say, okay, yep, those things are interesting, but they are not answers to the big questions of life. Your identity does not come from that, and true meaning and purpose does not come through the pursuit of these things. And as a footnote on that, we give you the entirety of human history. So it's not like there isn't empirical evidence to go behind this. So stay the course, find a place to be, and find what it means to live there well in relationship with other human people, and ask daily what it is that God wants of you, and let your life grow and be built by somebody who's better organizing human lives than you are. And so that's a really delightful way to live. And so I think we should be among the people who one of our opening lines in life, when somebody asks us how we are, is to be able to say, despite it all, actually, we're really satisfied. So let's pray and learn and grow in that direction and see what the Lord does with us. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.